everybody. For those of us joining us online, thank you for joining us and welcome to our presentation. We are Conflict 625, Engaging Conflict, which is a graduate level course here at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And it's essentially just a way for students to apply the theories that we learn in class on the ground. So with Dr. Sara Cobb, we decided to, as a class, look into intra-party conflict in the U.S. Essentially, our problem statement is what are the main intra-party conflicts in the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States? And how can we use conflict discourse analysis to assess these fissures? Essentially what that means is we basically look, a lot of the, and this is a part of the context, a lot of the current political discourse in the U.S. surrounds inter-party conflict, which means conflict between the Democratic and Republican parties. We thought it would be interesting to analyze it intrally. So what are the conflicts and fissures within the Democratic Party and then also within the Republican Party? A lot of this kind of came from the fact that the 2016 presidential election brought a lot of hidden narratives out in our country. We realized that there were actually conflicts within different fragments of both larger parties, and that essentially generated a lot higher political activity than we had seen in a long time. Again, this idea came out of the fact that there are heightened and polarized narratives on both sides, and a lot of that, or some of those narratives have actually resorted to violence, divisiveness, and other negative consequences. Recursivity within the U.S. social and political fabrics was a really large reason why we thought this would be really cool. And then lastly, the 2018 midterm elections were structured at a time within our class where we could really get into the population of Arlington at a time where politics is a super hypersensitive issue. So briefly, before we get into the data and what we found, some implications for conflict resolution. So the first really important implication is that understanding intra-party fissures can help break recursivity within parties in the larger U.S. political system. By breaking that recursivity and getting people out of their long-held narratives can actually lead to meaningful change. Second, helping parties solve fissures could actually lead to a more tolerant and cohesive party narratives. As we know, cohesivity and tolerance also equals to increased collective action and a more productive democracy. When people see their politicians and their leaders actually cooperating, they're going to cooperate on the ground as well. Third, discourse analysis can help create more effective intervention strategies. So that idea of, as conflict resolution practitioners, we're going to move away from, we're going to not only focus on doing no harm, but understand how even the tiniest interactions we have with our subjects and in our research can shake the system or change what it is we are researching. So going in, being more self-aware of our role as conflict resolution researchers. As I stated earlier as well, it can open new narratives that stem from historical, social, and political narratives in the U.S., which is also a second part of that breaking recursivity. So by allowing people to explore themselves internally and explore their party internally, we give them the opportunity to create new ideas and actually reach across the aisle in different ways. And then lastly, through understanding and identifying the origins of extreme narratives and fissures, could help conflict resolution practitioners in the United States actually prevent conflict and transform conflict by knowing where those narratives come from, how those narratives emerge, and how they interplay with different dynamics within those parties.
Thanks, Mina. My name is Yusuf Sultan, and I will be doing a presentation on the data collection methods. So through the course of this semester, we're able to engage in a variety of different data collection methods, with the primary objective being to identify fissures within the Democratic and Republican Party that could be potential causes and resources or reasons for intra-party conflict. The activities or data collection methods included a survey, which was designed by the class and also shared by the class, interviews and focus groups, as well as a dialogue session that took place pre and post midterm elections. The first data collection method that we engaged in was a survey. And the reason why we did the survey was to gauge the current attitudes towards both the Democratic and Republican Party. The survey was designed on a program called Qualtrics, and it consisted of about 30 questions. A portion of the questions requested general demographic information from the respondents, which allowed us to learn more about who we were engaging with. Some of the questions in this survey include such things as how old are you, what is the highest level of education that you've completed, and what region of the country do you reside in, and so forth. The second portion of the survey got into what parties our respondents identified with and what their attitudes were, once again, to the current political climate. Some of the questions in that portion of the survey asked questions like, are you motivated to vote in the upcoming congressional elections? Why or why not? Do you feel your party's headed in the right direction? And would you say your loyalty to your preferred political party has changed from the 2016 general elections? We received approximately 290 responses, and through brief analysis, we noticed that a common trend reinforced this notion that the current political climate is causing a split within the U.S. and further polarization. But we did a deeper dive, and that presented a few fissures within the parties, one of which is a common one that will be discussed later on in the presentation. The second data collection method was focus groups and interviews. These focus groups and interviews were conducted to get a deeper understanding of both, once again, the attitudes towards the current political climate, but an effort on our part was to try to weed out any fissures within the Democratic and Republican Party. Results from the survey were used to inform how we go about conducting the focus groups and interviews, especially when it came time to generating and asking probing questions. As a side note, the reason for doing either focus groups or interviews, a lot of classmates that you'll see presenting today are, one, full-time students, but also have a full-time job. So holding a focus group for some posed a greater challenge in comparison to doing an interview, which is one-on-one via phone. Once again, the findings from the focus groups and interviews will be discussed a bit more later on in the presentation. And the third and final method of data collection that we engaged in was dialogue sessions. But before I go into it, I want to state that the process of having a survey, then a focus group, as well as the interviews, and going into the dialogue session was all purposely done. The way I envisioned it, it was kind of like you have an onion, you're peeling back the layers, and you're trying to get to the core. And the core here is we're trying to get to the core issues to identify intra-party conflict. We held two dialogue sessions. One took place pre-midterm elections, and one took post-midterm. The method we used for the dialogue sessions was the World Cafe, which in short allowed attendees to sit around a couple of tables. Each table had a facilitator assigned to it, and we discussed a predetermined topic or question, and then after a few minutes, folks had the chance to get up and go to another table to engage with folks they hadn't before. At the very end, attendees got around, and then we basically did a readout and tried to identify trends from the dialogue sessions. Some of the questions that we asked during these sessions were things like, tell us about a time when you might have felt distant or unheard by your political party. What is your vision about how your party might move forward in light of the partisanship and polarization, and so forth. I also want to make one last comment here, is that if there's anything that you can take away from the data collection method, is that it was a progression of being more and more interactive with our respondents and attendees. And most importantly, it allowed us to have different methods of data collection. That's it.
Thank you, Yusuf. My name is Sandra Tomben. I'm part of this class be talking to you about our method of data analysis. So what we used for the data that we've collected throughout the semester is argumentation and critical discourse analysis. So there is a new term within critical discourse analysis that focuses on argumentation and the study of arguments. And so this term within critical discourse analysis looks at how arguments are used in text and how people communicate political arguments in text. And so critical discourse analysis comes from critical theory, which looks at the study of power and how power is manifested in the use of language and in different mediums of communication. And then argumentation theory comes from logic and philosophy, and it looks at arguments, how people construct arguments, and the purpose of these arguments in trying to communicate a particular point to an audience. Within critical discourse analysis, discourse analysts look at what is being said, how it is said, and the message that it communicates. So language isn't just something that we use to say things, but it's something that communicates certain actions, perceptions, and views, and that's what critical discourse analysis does in the study of language. And then argumentation looks at the description, analysis, and evaluation of arguments. And so this term has been really kind of helpful for us in terms of digesting some of the data that we've collected throughout the semester. Within the argumentative turn in critical discourse analysis, political discourse is defined as fundamentally argumentative. That is, people who are engaged in political conversations or political debates are communicating arguments. And it is the analysis of those arguments that critical discourse analysis and argumentation theory help us understand. Within argumentation theory, arguments are defined as a communicative and interactional act complex. And what this really means is that arguments are about the structure that is surrounding the argument, the context in which the argument is made, and whether the argument is made explicitly or implicitly. So as you'll see with some of the data that we've collected, some of them are clear arguments that people are making. You could identify the structure of it and the context, but some of it you're trying to understand the context because the argument isn't as explicitly made as you would in, say, an article or a document that comes straight from logic or philosophy. And so that's some of the things that my classmates will walk us through at a later point. So Fairclough and Fairclough, who have done a lot of work focused on critical discourse analysis, have identified a limitation within this particular tradition where the study of arguments has been kind of limited. If critical discourse analysis focuses on the study of text and communication, then how come arguments aren't a focus? And so what they identify as lacking is there's a need within critical discourse analysis for a systematic attempt to identify, reconstruct, analyze, and on this basis evaluate any particular arguments in text. And so what they advocate for is really looking at the kinds of arguments people make in political discourse, political conversations, and political text in general. And this is what we tried to do this semester with the data that we've collected. So from kind of incorporating argumentation theory and critical discourse analysis, Fairclough and Fairclough developed a model for critical discourse analysis, for analyzing arguments. And this is the model that we used for the data that we've collected. So this model basically looks at the different elements that shape to make an argument. So there's the values, there's the means and goals for that particular value, there's a particular goal that people who make arguments are envisioning, and then there are circumstances that guide this particular argument, and then there's a particular claim for a certain way of action or a certain argument that people are stating. So the value basically looks at what is at the core, what's the perspective from which someone is making a particular argument. So what is it that they value the most, and that is the value that leads them to make that particular argument or particular claim. With the value, you also need a mean goal. So someone who's engaged in political arguments is envisioning a particular end goal, right, a particular claim, and they envision that by doing this particular action or articulating this particular claim, this is how we get to that future that we envision. And that future is the goal, which is a state of affairs where the future looks a bit different, a future that reflects more the value of the speaker and the argument that they make. And then within the goals, you also look at the circumstances in which arguments are made. So arguments are made in a void, they're made based on the circumstances that shape the speaker's perceptions, the attitudes, and reflections on life. And so those circumstances could be facts, institutional facts, their values, their social relationships, any political changes that are happening in that particular context, help them define what that goal is, right? And help them articulate why that particular action should be taken or advocated for. And so some of my classmates will walk you through how we've applied this methodology, looking at what is it that people who are engaged in political arguments are claiming or pushing for, what is the argument that they're making, and how that argument is supported by circumstances around that particular action that they're advocating for, the goals that they envision that this action would lead to, and then how these, the mean goals for why that particular action would lead to that particular future, and then the value that really undergirds the particular argument and the particular perception that they, the particular claim that they would like to advocate for. So what this really allows us to do is like get a deep dive into the data that we've collected, trying to deconstruct it a little bit and get to understand some of those intra-party conflicts that we've encountered from the data and the participants we've had this semester. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gil Topaz. I'm going to be presenting the argument breakdown of the Qualtrics survey. So the Democratic claim from the survey that we could come up with was they felt that most of the Trump politics should be reversed, especially such as the tax break for corporate companies and the immigration policies. So the circumstances that brought about these feelings were the election of Trump and the so-called controversial defeat of Hillary, or unexpected defeat of Hillary, and the political action and rhetoric that follows. They don't appreciate the way that he presents himself around the world, and his rhetoric, especially on social media, has caused a lot of issues. The goals for the Democrats is a more inclusive approach that fosters equality and humanity at all levels, and they feel like that's been rejected by the Trump administration. And so the value going forward is they want inclusion and progression. So they'd like stuff such as climate change to be pushed forward, which the Trump administration has obviously has regressed. So the Republican claim is that the current politics and administration's agenda should be maintained and pursued. Their argument for that is the economic boom that we've seen in the stock markets obviously going up, and then they also argue for the focus on immigration. They see a need to cut back on the immigration policies and to make the borders much more secure. So the goal is economic stability, continue the growth of the markets, and then a strong national security, which comes with the implementation of a harder immigration process. They also look for international sovereignty. They felt like the U.S. lost respect during the Obama administration, and they feel like Trump has gained back that respect by leveraging the U.S. in trade deals and creating tariffs, especially against China. So the values of the Republican Party going forward is fiscal responsibility, which they feel like they've gotten with their tax bill, and they're looking to implement actually some more tax cuts and different tax bills in the near future, and also maintaining a national image of respect and America first.
My name is Gabby Saxon, and I'm going to walk us through some of the fissures that we've been able to identify with our data analysis, and then I will also walk us through the analysis of both intra-party conflicts of Republican and Democrats. We started our data collection with our surveys, and from the get-go we were able to identify some of the fissures. We were able to leverage that first set of data to then enrich it with our focus groups and dialogues. But to start with our survey, I pulled some of the quotes that we received based on a question that was, what is the greatest issue for you between you and your party? We found that there are Republicans who, first of all, support Trump, and then the Republicans who are anti-Trump. We had people respond that they were either 100% with Trump, there was nothing that was an issue for them with their party, and then there were those who identified the president as putting the party in bad light and putting the party in a place where extremists and closet racists are able to come out. There was also a response that a Republican said the president does not share my position on some of their issues that they hold dear. So that was one of the first and most obvious fissures we were able to identify, and then further dig into upon further data collection. Another was a not tough enough response for the Republican Party. Those who are a little bit more hardliners, thinking that their party is too passive and that they need to be a little bit more extreme against leftists. And also that they're not working at a fast enough pace. They need more fortitude in the party. So there's Republicans who are maybe dissatisfied for those reasons. There's a fissure amongst those in the Republican Party who are more libertarian. Those who prefer small, limited, minimal government. They prefer more needs for House and Senate term limits, elimination of career politicians, minimal government in general. That was a big fissure. That has pushed a lot of Republicans out of the party. Then there was a sentiment of nostalgia for an older version of the party. There was a quote, "My party has gone greedy crazy. I don't recognize Republicans anymore." And then another quote that said that the Republicans have abandoned almost all traditionally held beliefs. Then there were some Republicans we were able to identify that agree with conservative principles, but not the current stances and policies. Those who support the EPA and feel strongly about environmental issues, but their party isn't, or those who believe in more social issues that need to be addressed, such as abortion. So those quotes from the survey were examples of some of the starts that we were able to hook onto, and then we collected more information. I'll skip to a quick analysis of that data, where the fissures, we use the methodology to be a bit more clear about how we're making sense of these. The first claim is that people experienced betrayal. The analysis for the Republican fissures. The role of tradition and history versus present struggles. It was better in the past. This is sort of a sentiment we kept hearing. People refer to the era of Eisenhower and Reagan as like the glory days of the Republican Party, and the party has not maybe met those expectations, especially since the election of Trump. So some of those values that are being held are nostalgia, value of history, the past, tradition, and then the goal is to restore the principles of the Republican Party that were those that were valued during the era of Reagan and Eisenhower. That's a big fissure right there. A second fissure in the Republican Party is that some believe in conservative principles and prefer small government, but are not interested in the current rhetoric of nationalism. So some Republicans want to distance themselves, the support from Trump and those who support Trump and this sort of nationalist rhetoric that has been associated with this administration. And the values here are those of nationalism versus traditional conservatives and conservatism. The goal here is to return, again, the party to traditional principles of conservatism rather than principles of nationalism. A third claim is the Republican Party should be more inclusive. Inclusivity is needed because some minority voters believe in the party platform, but don't necessarily feel welcome or representative in the party. The values here are inclusivity, participation, and small government. Goals to make the party more accessible for different groups would benefit and be able to reach a wider set of the population. The fourth claim of a fissure that we found is some believe in conservative principles, but don't believe the current agenda platform aligned with traditional conservative principles. These are all sort of related. And the conservatives are identifying as libertarians in response to the party's shift. The values of small government and states' rights and individual freedom and rights seem to have shifted in recent years so that a lot of libertarian conservatives don't see that they're aligned with the current platform. So So the goal is to support a stance of minimal government. Now, backtracking to the Democrat fissures that we first were able to identify in our survey and then supplement later on with more data collection. And some of the fissures we pulled out from the beginning was the stance on bipartisanship. Democrats who believe that the parties should be more willing to compromise across the aisle, and they're wanting to work together with Republicans. And then we got a response quite the opposite from that in our survey that said, I believe bipartisanship will be the end of our nation. So that's these are two very contradictory quotes that we received from our survey, which was interesting to supplement in our later data collection. Some other ideas of fissures is that the party's not strong enough, it's too much talk and not enough action. People think that that accepting civility is being too passive, and that apparently to win elections, we have to play the game we're in. So Democrats are looking for a little bit more action from their party. They want to have a longer-term goals, have a vision of the long-term goals. They want the party to be a little bit more bold and take a stance on the key issues and also act on those. There's a big fissure that we identified between moderate and progressive Democrats. In our survey, we got a lot of responses of people who said that they are more progressive than their party line. And then we had multiple respondents who said they're more moderate than their party line, so that was definitely a fissure that we learned more about during our focus groups and dialogues as well. Then we started to hear this idea that people aligned with the Democratic Party, sort of, but they weren't necessarily proud of the party, but they were proud of the fact that they were against Trump. And one respondent said any differences they may have with the party are inconsequential until the regime is voted out of office. And another respondent said Democrats are focusing on the wrong thing, which is Donald Trump's shenanigans, and not talking enough about policy. Not proud of what their party is doing, but they're definitely against Trump, so they're going to align more with the Democrats. So how we made sense of some of this, and then some of the data we collected after that, is that some of the fissures are people experience betrayal during the 2016 election. Democrats who were voting for Bernie felt that they were betrayed and when Hillary got the nomination. The nomination process was not as deliberative as it was divisive, pushing progressives away from the Democratic Party. The values held here are participatory, fair and transparent, and deliberate, non-party machine processes in the selection of leaders. And the goal is the representation of their group. Another fissure is the Democratic Party is not progressive enough. The party represents values of human rights, social services, inclusivity, but there isn't enough action and the party is too passive. So the values here are human rights, social reform, equality. The goal is to act, to spearhead, and pass policy that addresses issues of social, economic, and environmental justice. A third claim is that some liberals take pride in their stance against Trump and the Republican Party, but don't necessarily feel attached or pride in the Democratic Party. People do not feel there is a party that perfectly represents them. They align more with the Democratic Party because of the feeling they are choosing between lesser two evils. The value here is solidarity against the other, their worldview, and especially against Trump. The goal is to take a stance and oppose the other. The final claim is the party isn't representative of those who are more moderate. Some prefer bipartisanship and are turned off by polarization, and they prefer a more moderate stance. Collaboration, cooperation, fiscal responsibility, social justice are some of the values held. And the goal is to meet in the middle across the aisle and find common ground to address policy. So overall, these are fissures that we were able to identify over the course of our semester and our research. We collected all this data, and the way we made meaning of this data was with the argumentation theory, breaking ideas down by what the claim was, circumstances, values, and goals. And these were just the biggest fissures that we were able to identify using this methodology.
So as a part of our analysis on the research, and a part of the discourse analysis, we looked into values behind a lot of the arguments and a lot of the fissures that we were seeing within the dialogues and the focus groups in the survey. So to briefly talk about one of the values that we saw had a really big impact on what the participants thought, one value was evolution. So we saw that youth on the whole spectrum of affiliation noted that an age gap in terms of party leadership and ideology. So to them, those were two really big things. So essentially the argument goes that parties do not have young leaders and their platforms do not encompass the ideologies, needs, and wants of young people. Aside from that, party leadership does not reflect youth, and party leadership does not keep up with the ideas of youth and young voters. And we saw that, especially with a lot of the younger participants, they didn't affiliate with the party specifically. Also, as Gabby was noting earlier, a lot of people would be like, well, I kind of lean Republican, but I'm not Republican, or I kind of lean Democrat, but I'm not Democrat. It's just that label was not attractive to them. So the Republican side, you could see young Republicans were more socially liberal. Young Republicans rejected hateful and divisive rhetoric, they valued diversity, and young Republicans prefer moderate politicians. On the Democratic side, you saw that young Democrats are more socially and fiscally liberal. Young Democrats also rejected hateful and divisive rhetoric, and young Democrats also felt neglected due to the suppression of the progressive wing. So on the Democratic side, a lot of that came from the 2016 election when young people really wanted Bernie Sanders to be the Democratic candidate. When that didn't happen, they saw that as an attack on them, their values, their ideologies, and for that reason they got pushed away from the Democratic Party. For Republicans, seeing this new trend of populism that Trump has brought to them, that was unattractive, and that kind of pushed them away. And for a lot of the young Republicans we talked to, they were really excited for when their generation gets to be in power and actually reflect their own ideologies and their own views on social and economic issues within the Republican Party.
Thank you, Mina. My name is Dominika Ekona, and I'm going to continue consistent with the methodology that we chose, fair flow, to talk about the values during our world dialogue sessions that we held. And one of them is tradition. Some conservatives look to the past as an example of proper conduct. So, as was the case with some of our guests, they spoke about the romanticized past. Particularly, they mentioned the Eisenhower era, when the politics was somehow better than right now. We checked, and we found out that the Eisenhower era was the last one in history of the Republican Party, when they were supported the labor unions, and they were not engaging in the moral issues, such as, for example, human sexuality or abortion. And it seems like some of the guests were feeling nostalgic about the past. Another value somehow contrasting with the tradition, we had fairness and neutrality on this other hand. It was a value held at our first dialogue event rather than at our focus groups or the survey. It was significant nevertheless because the behavior was replicated during the second event, so we can claim consistency. In other words, people did not affirm political identity. Our other value was fairness and neutrality. So in other words, people did not affirm political identity. They claimed that they're independent. Some valued disengagement over disagreement. It might Well, we interpreted it as perhaps it might translate into people withdrawing from voting instead as a demonstration of their fairness. Since they cannot subscribe behind either political party, they'd rather withdraw. Additionally, we found the moral component to the neutrality claim, to the overall judgment of the current political culture. Some people even said about it that it is a circus or a mess. With that, our guests fairly criticized across the political spectrum, or at least refrained from blaming only one side. There were moral reasons for neutrality, we might conclude. Continuing with the values, we have accountability and moderation. So people had conversations about overcoming obstacles in their life. Some spoke about personal accountability, they were mostly more conservative ones, and others about extended social system, and that was true for more liberal guests. So while self-reliance was a common theme, there were differences about the responsibilities assigned either to the state or to personal support system. Some conversations revolved around the lack of security in other countries in comparison to the United States. We could call it global accountability. Within the conservatives, there were immigrants who told narratives about pulling themselves by the bootstraps, yet they were thinking more globally than isolationists would. The lines were blurred between the parties there. Lastly, actually, likewise among the Democrats, the extended social system did not always mean universal free healthcare. There were differences in the level of self-reliance vis-a-vis relying on the state. Again, here comparisons to failed states globally were made. In the value of moderation, the comparison, the lack of humility in the politicians was the most off-putting to the participants. Proper decorum was underscored and the need to reach across the party lines for collaboration and education. To conclude the portion about values, there could be a couple questions raised for further research. Do arguments raised by people in our research apply to the general population, or did group dynamic create a mood for compromise during the World Cafe events? Admittedly, our sample consisted of well-educated people, and our World Cafe events were conducted at the premises of the school, so we did not probably reach cross-section of the society. However, we consistently obtained similar results during the first and second event. Did group dynamic create a mood for compromise during the World Cafe? The atmosphere was more agreeable than contentious. As we mentioned before, the groups embraced the values of neutrality. However, reaching out a compromise is not the same as giving up their political beliefs. So it only confirms the value of fairness that people held. Finally, the two-party system. Under what conditions people are more likely to search beyond the Republican-Democrat duality? And how does the constituent age factor in? To answer that, I'm going to mention Scott Christmas, who wrote the book, The Washington's Nightmare. It was our assigned reading. And he concludes the book with a statement that we might indeed be outgrowing the two-party political system, and be it because the access to political information through the media bubbles, or the polarization, or the sheer size and scope of the American territory, and the issue of representation tied to it. We also found in another research that some data points out that indeed the third-party search among the constituents might just begun. Data shows that in 2016 presidential elections, 17% of voters were for the third-party candidates, and to contrast that, in 2008, only 3% were of the electorate supporting the third-party candidate. So how does the constituent age factor in? Well, the point of reference is young people, and we tend to think that they are the agents of change. So we just don't know yet under what conditions will the situation become ripe for them to act.
Thank you very much, Domenica. Good evening, I'm Karen Werner. I'll be covering the limitations and conclusions parts of this presentation. So there are a number of different possible limitations to think about in relation to any findings from our activities. These are just a few that we might think about. So in relation to the survey, there are different types of errors that we need to take into account. Also, in terms of our focus groups, we used various different approaches. Some of us used interviews of individuals, and others of us focused on groups. And then lastly, another major consideration would be geographic. In terms of our geographic limitation, most of our participants were from Northern Virginia. So that's yet another consideration when we think about our findings. So in starting to think about our conclusions, we're transitioning here to a forward-looking view. And in a visioning exercise, participants identified several potential themes for further contemplation in the future. These are listed here, but briefly, they include grassroots, bottom-up reform, so that people have stated they feel distant in the current political situation. They feel that they're not fully represented, such as by a system of top-down government. They want a government that is closer and more responsive to the people, and they value responsiveness and accountability. Another potential theme in this visioning exercise pertains to education. Specifically, people spoke of a need for broadening horizons, such as that they would think there's too much narrow thinking now in the existing political structure and environment. As stated earlier, another theme, law and order. That whole concept of looking back to the Eisenhower era of discipline. Another potential theme, humility, that the current political environment and participants lack humility. There's a need for less arrogance in how parties, leaders, and participants regard others, and the need to address polarization. So that line of thinking would be that in the current political system, there's not enough cooperation or listening, whether intra-party or inter-party. Another two-party system reform, which is addressed in the next slide as well. And that idea that two-party system leaves out some voices can be viewed as a failure and not representative or inclusive of all. In that line of thinking, there's a need to be inclusive of all voices to have a successful political process. So from there, we are now looking toward what we did again, we examined arguments produced through our survey, focus groups, and dialogues. And so in sum, overall, despite our limitations, we were able to analyze various arguments, identifying some intra-party fissures. Example of a fissure, the nationalists versus traditional conservative Republicans, the example of Democrats in terms of progressives, calling for greater transparency in internal party processes. Some participants felt a lack of a sense of feeling fully represented at all by a political party or group. Others spoke in terms of a need for change in the political system, in terms of polarity, possibly also in institutions or rules. Our findings are colored by the fact that many participants disavowed strict loyalty to a political party or downplayed the role of parties in their political landscape. Potential consistency is noted here in terms of one of our readings, in terms of the concept of an exhausted majority. People are, quote, often hesitant to weigh in for fear of saying the wrong thing. And so from there, and in conclusion, this slide shows system-level changes that were proposed by participants across our survey, focus groups, and dialogues. Listed here, electoral college played into this, voting systems, selection of party leadership, again, as stated, the two-party system, and representation, such that party leaders and politicians do not reflect demographic or ideological diversity in the nation. So we found overall deep fissures within the parties, and in light of this, there are areas of interest that overlap the various groups, and from this, there are opportunities for new relationships that open the door for the formation of new groups, alliances, and connections. Thank you.